One of the hallmarks of President Trump's campaign to become president in 2024 was that he was going to end the Russia-Ukraine war. He placed that as one of his highest priorities. And as soon as he's gotten into office, he has continued to make good on that effort as he has started diplomacy that was completely absent and lacking prior to that. Right off the bat, he got into it. And now we've had several rounds of negotiations. He's sent delegations to Saudi Arabia. He's personally gotten on the phone with Vladimir Putin. And the latest effort in that is sending Steve Witkoff back to Russia, where yesterday he met Vladimir Putin in St. Petersburg, where Putin was doing some business of some sort in the Russian side. To continue on those conversations. That's after Witkoff had actually met with a different Russian representative, Dmitriev, I believe his name is, both in Washington, then earlier in the day. And then, according to the Russian media, the meeting with Witkoff lasted about 5 hours, where obviously this is the latest in a long string of meetings. So it looks like maybe things are making some progress. We're getting towards, you see the men were very happy when they were shaking hands there. It didn't look like one of those situations where nobody was getting what they wanted. And in fact, a lot of the news coming out is that there may be, in fact, progress between Putin and Trump, which could potentially forestall or foreshadow another meeting between the two leaders, possibly another phone call, or if things develop far enough, an actual meeting. If you see a meeting being announced, that's going to be a strong indication that at least between Putin and Trump, that an agreement may be close to being made. In fact, I would go so far as to say that if you see them set up a personal meeting, then they're probably going to come out of there with some kind of an agreement. It seems unlikely that Trump would risk his personal capital by just having another conversation that doesn't result in anything. But what that something is going to be and what those terms are is shrouded in secrecy and, in fact, in confusion. Because while you have Steve Witkoff going there to St. Petersburg and talking to Putin, you also have Keith Kellogg, which was the original Trump's original envoy for the Russia and Ukraine situation. He was subsequently reassigned to only the Ukraine portion of that, but he has got a competing vision. He also has publicly taken to task something that that Witkoff has said there, and in fact, you can see this Newsweek offer here. This is out today. So Steve Witkoff's Putin's offer sparked sharp backlash of evil, and according to a plan put forward by U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff to end the war started by Russian President Vladimir Putin, gives Moscow the green light to occupy swaths of Ukraine. A charity told Newsweek. Yuri Boychenko, the CEO of Hope for Ukraine, which provides aid to the war-torn country, told Newsweek that it was, quote, completely unacceptable that the top U.S. envoy would embrace such evil demands from Russia. The proposal would give Moscow ownership of 4 eastern regions of Ukraine it claimed to have annexed but does not fully control. That corresponds with what I've been talking about for many, many months, is the so-called June 14 lines that Putin laid out in June 14th of last summer. And when you look at what that's going to mean, as I pointed out many times, there are large sections of the southern 3 of those provinces which are still under Ukrainian control. And I've told you it would be enormously difficult for Trump to politically to agree to a situation like that, because that would require the actual withdrawal of Ukrainian armed forces out of those areas that they currently control and they have for the most of the war. And that's going to make it very difficult. But as we've also said, that recognizes the reality on the ground. And the longer we don't pay attention to that, the longer we don't even contemplate that, then the longer the war goes on and the more Ukrainian people die, and the greater the possibility that Russia ends up just rolling on over to the Dnieper River, not just to the borders of those 4 provinces. And I think that we're getting closer to a point that we've been warning about for a long time, that there's going to be a decision point that's going to have to be made. And it's probably primarily going to have to be made in Kiev among the Ukrainian leadership, because they're going to really come to a point to where they either say, okay, we're going to concede to what Trump and Putin have agreed to, or we're going to ignore Trump and we're going to continue fighting. We're going to look over to Europe, see if we can get them to help us and continue the war. Wouldn't put a lot of credibility in that. Wouldn't put my life on the line based on that. But that's one of the things that is the decision point that's coming up on here. But now it's not only that, because actually Lavrov, after that meeting took place yesterday in St. Petersburg, today Sergei Lavrov seems to be reiterating some of these issues. The only way to solve the problem and achieve sustainable peace is to address the root causes of the conflict. President Trump became the first and I think the only Western leader who repeatedly repeated that it was a mistake to drag Ukraine into NATO, and that's one of the root causes that we pointed out many times. So that's one of the other issues. So whatever the land is going to be, the Russians are emphatically saying at the same time, making sure everybody understands that it's not just the land, but it's also neutrality. It's also a declaration there will never be NATO in Ukraine, not now, not later. And then, of course, the other issue, which was not raised, at least in public, but the Russians are very adamant about, is the demilitarization and the denazification. So the asks just keep coming and they keep getting harder. But if you don't get to that first one, which is the territorial issues, you don't even get to address the other ones here. All that to say that this is moving to a point of decision making, but the choices get worse and worse and harder for any politician on the Western/Ukrainian side to make. Now, if it was only those issues there, it would be really, really difficult. But on Trump's side, there's also an issue about his two senior officials, Witkoff and Kellogg, who has, oddly enough, and it's puzzling to me, seems like they would be synchronizing their public messages before anybody says anything. But Kellogg actually has pushed back against this a little bit. Yeah, if you could put that Newsweek article back up here, there was one thing in there. I have a call out in the right here. This is further down in the article. It said that this CEO of Hope for Ukraine, Boycheko, said Steve Witkoff is basically saying to our over 800,000 civilians living in the city of Zaporizhia, the city of Kherson, and surrounding areas controlled by Ukraine to self-deport, and the Ukrainian government to give the green light to Russia to occupy these Ukrainian cities and villages, citing U.S. officials and people familiar with the situation. Reuters reported that Keith Kellogg, Trump's Ukrainian envoy, had pushed back against the plan because saying Kiev would never agree to unilaterally cede ownership of the territories, but Trump did not change his strategy. Well, listen, that illustrates the issue, the very issue that I'm talking about, where it's going to be incredibly difficult for any Ukrainian politician to agree to, because he's right. I mean, we got to be honest. That is the case. If you give those territories, if the United States says, yes, we recognize Russian control over those, that is your price necessary to end this war, that means that those people living there will have to make a choice. Either you stay under Russian administration or you self-deport and go to elsewhere inside of Ukraine. Where they would go, we're talking a large number of people. That's apparently 800,000 in the city of Kherson alone. Living in the countryside of all the other smaller towns and villages, all of them would come to that same situation. Mykolaiv, et cetera. There's quite a number of pretty good sized towns and cities in those areas. But that is the cost, because the alternative is we'll just keep fighting, and that the Russians will just keep on capturing territory, killing Ukrainian troops in the meantime, and then in the end, not stop at those four administrative borders. That's the real conundrum. And I don't underestimate how hard it would be. But I also emphatically plead practically with Zelensky to recognize the reality on the ground, the combat reality, the industrial reality, the economic reality, the diplomatic realities, everything you want to look at. You can't stay where you're at. I'm going to show you why that's a little bit more tangible and put some dollar figures on it here in a minute. But a couple of other things I want to look at here was not only did Kellogg push back against Witkoff on that issue there, saying that they would never agree to it, but he also had his own plan. And he also put that he was visiting with the Times of London in an interview, which came out, I think, yesterday, where he said that Ukraine could be divided like post-war Berlin. Keith Kellogg, a leading figure for the U.S. efforts to end the three-year war, suggested that British and French troops could adopt zones of control in the west of the country as part of a reassurance force. That's something that we've shown you that Keir Starmer tagged that title there. With Russia's army in the occupied east, between them would be a Ukrainian forces and a demilitarized zone of 18 kilometers. Kellogg said that the Anglo-French-led force west of the Dnipro River, which bisects Ukraine from north to south and runs through Kiev, would not be provocative at all to Moscow. And I got to think, okay, wait a minute. You're suggesting your grand idea, because you're claiming that Ukraine would never agree to willingly cede those territories to the June 14 lines, that a better plan that Russia would not be a problem with because it wouldn't be provocative would be to have a zone with an Anglo-French force in it. French and British troops who, just to point out the obvious, members of NATO, and they have been supplying long-range weapons and all kinds of lethal support to the Ukraine side from the beginning, which kills Russian troops and kills Russian civilians and citizens on Russian territory. And you propose that having military force in the western part of Ukraine would not be provocative at all. Now, that's very interesting, because if you listen to anything that Russia has said ever, they would find that rather provocative. That is almost a verbatim statement that the Western side used in the decades prior to this war starting, when we kept saying, look, NATO coming up to Ukraine, that's not provocative at all. We're a defensive alliance. What's Russia's problem, man? We're not offensive. We're just going to move up here. Don't worry about it. That's the statement they used, and they expected Russia to accept it. Russia never accepted it. And then, of course, in February 22, they finally acted on it and showed that even though they'd been saying so since 2007, that was a problem, they finally acted in 2022 after all that, those years, those 2 full decades of time, or nearly 2 full decades, where they finally acted on it. But now our brilliant general, retired general, thinks that what they won't find this provocative will continue on. Well, you should listen to what, let's look first at Sergei Lavrov, who specifically and directly addressed this to actually a friend of our show, Larry Johnson, when he went and visited with Sergei Lavrov.
If NATO expansion is recognized, at least by Donald Trump, as one of the root causes, then the presence of the troops from NATO countries under any flag, in any capacity on Ukrainian soil, is the same threat.
So
is the same threat.
You won't accept it under any conditions?
Under any conditions, well, nobody is talking to us. They keep saying nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine, but they do everything about Russia without Russia.
It's sorry about that. It's funny because, you have Kellogg saying, oh, it's not provocative at all. And then you have 1 month ago, this is not ancient history. Obviously, Russia's been saying this since 2007, but if you don't want to go that far back, go back to one single month ago, March 12th, you see the date on that. Sergei Lavrov said, under no circumstances, under any conditions. Mario, I actually asked him, who was also in that same meeting along with Judge Napolitano, he said, under any circumstances, name, title, whatever you want to call it, the answer is absolutely no. No NATO troops whatsoever in Ukraine, or we'll consider them a hostile force. And now here, Keith Kellogg actually wants to pitch that as a possibility. Now, there was an interesting, because there was a kind of a rebuttal of sort in the Kiev Independent, where says, oh, Kellogg saying, hey, no, I clarified that. I was taken out of context. Now, I thought he might be saying, no, I didn't really say that we would divide the country up, or that it would somehow be okay. That's not what he walked back. What he said was in a tweet that an ex post he put out, he said the Times article misrepresents what I said. I was speaking of a post-ceasefire resiliency force in support of Ukraine's sovereignty. In discussions of partition, I was referencing areas or zones of responsibility for an allied force without U.S. troops. I was not referring to a partitioning of Ukraine. Is there any difference in that? I mean, what is he talking about? We're going to have a zone where there are NATO troops in support of Ukraine's sovereignty, which completely undermines everything that the Russians have been saying is their minimum lines. The June 14 lines, of course, it's not just the lines, it's also the conditions: demilitarization, denazification, no NATO unilaterally, or absolutely saying no NATO. Sergei Lavrov again admitted that was Putin from June 14th last summer, Lavrov from last month. And then now here we come with General Kellogg saying, yeah, this is what I'm talking about. We should do this. Here's actually the map if you want to look at it. And when you this is what Russia would see. So on the right here, this is the Berlin zones it was talked about. You had the Soviets in the east, and then you had American, British, and French zones here. This is the proposed map that Kellogg is talking about, where you see on the far right, that's the Russian zone. The Ukraine zone is a very small one in the middle. How he comes up with this is not explained. I don't understand why there's a Ukrainian zone and then a British, Ukraine, and French zone all the way to, which is the majority of the country, into the west. Because if it's in support of Ukraine's sovereignty, it seems like it should be one. There shouldn't be separate zones or anything else like that. So it's unclear even what he means in terms of what's on here. But you see that map. And when the Russians see this map, I assure you, they are seeing red. They're seeing, like a red cape in front of a bull saying charge here. So it is unclear what's going on. So you have Steve Witkoff apparently saying some version of the 14 June lines. Now, all that's being reported is that he is saying, which Trump has said several times, you're going to have to give up some territory. You're going to have to give up some terrain. It wasn't reported exactly what was in those discussions. How much land is he talking about? Is it the June 14 lines? Is it even more than that? And the question is a very valid one. In fact, let me pull up something that I had here, because this is something from, oh, shoot, I had it up in front of me and then it went down. I'm going to pull it right back up if you'll bear with me just a second. This is from a guy named John Helmer, who is an American Western reporter who's been stationed in Moscow for quite a number of years. Used to be the Russian correspondent for Business Insiders. So he used to work for a mainstream press, and now he's an independent journalist. He reported that after what was discussed in the Riyadh meetings, the Saudi Arabia meetings between the United States and Russia in February, where Russia first laid out its conditions, apparently a lot more than just the June 14 lines. This is what Helmer was reporting. He said, a well-informed source in Moscow says that Trump and his subordinates have been surprised by the Russian terms for ending the war. Quote, the Russians have told Americans that they will have Odessa and a land corridor to Moldova. The Russians have offered up ports on the Dnieper River and access to the sea for the Ukrainians. Let's see, money's being discussed. So a couple of other here's. He said that Lavrov and Yushakov, one of their primary negotiators, brought up no papers and asked Americans to dust off the December 21 draft treaty. The Russian positions shocked the Americans. So what apparently is being reported, he said, this is our sources from inside of Russia are saying that's what was discussed there. So then the question is, and it's not been answered, what was discussed yesterday in St. Petersburg? Because the Russians may be saying, oh, it's not just those 4 provinces. It's all the way to the Moldova in the south, and it was unclear from that what's going on, what's going to be north of that. Now, it's interesting that he says dust off that December 2021 draft treaty. You may recall we've talked about that many times. That was Putin had for years said just obey the Minsk Accords, just implement them, and we'll be good with it. But then when it was clear that war was coming, if they didn't, then he said, all right, here's a new treaty, which was worse conditions for the West than the situation was for the Minsk Accords for the Ukraine side, but it's still a whole lot better than anything that came after that, because at that time, one of the key issues was that it was for independence and limited autonomy for even all of eastern Ukraine, to include the Donbass, Luhansk, and Donetsk. Those at that time, they were saying they'll nominally still stay within the Ukraine Federation. That's why I just say the history will look back and be very, very cruel to the Western leaders, because they had on the table a deal that could have prevented the war from breaking out and would have left Ukraine short of Crimea whole and in control of Kiev. But instead, they dusted it off. But one of the key components of it was, which apparently is being referred to now, is neutrality and a denazification issue and a military limitation. There's apparently from those, there was 85,000 total troops were going to be allowed to stay on the Ukraine side there. And it's basically a constabulary force or a police force, but no offensive capacity. That's what Russia said we need now in order to have security on our flank, so we know that there won't be a war launched in the future against us. So I think that's what they mean when they say dust off the December 21 situation there. And listen, and if you need any more, certainty, if you need any more convincing on what the Russians are thinking, this is what Putin said. I think it was right when Trump was coming in there, that he is saying, we're not just looking to end the war. We're not looking to do what Kellogg put in there, which is an 18-kilometer ceasefire on the current line of contact. He said there's a little more to it.
We're also open for dialogue with the new US administration on the Ukrainian conflict. The most important thing here is to eliminate the fundamental reason for the conflict. That's the most important. And as for settling the situation itself, its goal should be not a brief ceasefire, not just getting some time to regroup and rearm and carry on the conflict, but long-term peace based on respect to lawful interests of all people and nationalities living in the region.
Yeah, that last part there, I think, is really indicative of where Russia's thinking, and could reflect what was said, what was reported by John Helmer. And that is that he said respect all the people and nationalities that live in this area. And if you look at a demographic map, there are a lot of ethnic Russians living on the east side of the current line of contact. And you're going all the way to Odessa, all the way up to Moldova, and certainly up in the north in the Kharkiv area, whatever. The further west you go, the lower the density of Russian percentage of people. But there are still considerable numbers of them through there. And I've heard some sources on the Russian side say there's no way in hell, to quote one of them, that Russia would ever say we're going to have an end of the war here that doesn't protect the ethnic Russians on the other side of the line of contact. That's the reason they went to war in the first place, was the Russians in the eastern part. And they're not going to just stop there and say, the rest of y'all, good luck to you, unless they have some, like the December 2021 deal, unless they have some strong, controllable measures to ensure that those people are going to be safe, and that there's not going to be any threat to the east against them from against the Russians from the west under any terms and circumstances. So you see a very, very consistent view, whether you're talking about Sergei Lavrov, Vladimir Putin, some of these Ryabkov, Peskov, etc., the Dmitriev. All of these guys are all talking from the same sheet of music. Meanwhile, you have on the United States side, you have different sheets of music. And it's not clear what Trump's, what his bottom line is and what he's looking to get done. He hasn't really said much recently. He's been kind of coy on the situation about what his objectives are. In fact, he hadn't said anything of any substance on it from the beginning, other than he wants the killing to be stopped. The question is, what is the price going to be that he's willing to pay politically to get that done? I mean, he's already, accused of all kinds of things, of being a puppet to Putin, of giving the green light to Putin, the evil Putin, all that kind of stuff that was said earlier in relation to the Kellogg portion and to what Steve Witkoff is doing. So he'll pay a price to do some of this stuff, or he won't. He'll not make a decision, and then Russia, I think, will take the choice out of his hands and continue to move forward. As a matter of fact, we have more evidence even today coming out of Ukraine that they say that it looks like that the offensive has begun up in the north, assuming the Chernihiv area. And as we've been reporting, there's been lots of military movement on the Russian side of the line of contact in the Zaporizhia area. There continues to be consistent pressure, especially up in the Kupiansk area, the Pokrovsk area in the middle, which had been the focus of a lot of stuff toward the fall of last year, is on a more of a dormant situation. The Russians aren't putting as much effort in that area at the moment. But the bottom line is, all along the line of contact, there still is constant friction, constant firepower, et cetera, and maybe an increase in both the north and the south. Meanwhile, you have the Ukraine side, as Sersky has admitted, they have a deficit every single month. They're not able to force enough people to come in to offset the losses that they're having on a daily basis. You also have defections and Ukrainian folks refusing to fight, et cetera. So it's not just killed and wounded, but it's also dereliction of duty, guys who are just not willing to, basically throw themselves into certain death situations in many cases. All those things keep weakening the Ukraine side. There's apparently news out this morning that they may extend the martial law, which I think expires on the 9th of May of this year, through August. And that could include, we're going to lower the draft age down to 18. So they're going to go after the absolute youngest of the potential military manpower that there is, because they don't have enough of all the other age groups. It's just unconscionable to me that you can see that you're not going to have that opportunity to ever reverse this on the battlefield. And instead of recognizing it and ending the destruction of your country, you're going to add a new category of people that you want to start sacrificing to certain death. It's just unbelievable to me that that is allowed, even by the people in the Ukraine. And listen, there was Zelensky himself got a boost yesterday at both the meeting of the coalition of the willing, and also in Ramstein earlier this week, where they said, "Hey, we got you another, I think, 21 billion euros or $18 billion or 18 billion pounds. I can't remember, but somewhere around $21 billion, a sizable number." Or is it? Because you have to look at it in context. That number one, is not a pile of money that was given to Ukraine. That's money that is going to be incrementally given in some capacities from some countries all the way through 2030. And some 26, 27, 28, 29, 30. All this stuff is deferred, which means the actual number here is pretty small. And that is even 1/3 of the number that the U.S. passed just a year ago at the end of the Biden administration. I believe it finally came in May of 2024, $61 billion. And we saw how $61 billion did not change the outcome. In fact, I've showed you over the time, I've showed you that chart that shows that when that $61 billion was finally approved and put into law and started being distributed, Russia actually accelerated its capture of Ukrainian territory and its killing of Ukrainian people. All those things accelerated after the 61. So why would any rational person think that because I got 21 billion this time and the United States did not add anything, and it's deferred over several years going forward. So the amount of stuff you're going to get in the next 12 months of fighting, if the war goes on that long, is minuscule and clearly not a fraction of what you need. At the same time, you don't have enough manpower. And then, of course, you also have concurrently the other side of that equation. You can't talk about war without both sides of the equation. And the Russian side is increasing its manpower. They have an increase, according to Sersky, of 7,000 to 8,000 more men per month they bring in than they lose in conflict. That Russia has around 5 million men of military age that is in a pool of semi-trained, whether that's had served previous conscripts, etc., that they could mobilize if they needed to. 5 million untapped resource. Ukraine has virtually none. In fact, now they're trying to add a new category. So all of those things should show you this needs to come to an end right now. So really, it looks like Steve Witkoff has the best plan on this. And then you have what's being floated by General Keith Kellogg, completely detached from reality. And listen, we got to address an elephant in the room here, which unfortunately many people aren't even aware of. We're going to make you aware of it today, and that is what in the hell is wrong with American generalship, because we keep getting it wrong at the highest levels for so long. I've shown you several clips recently from General Cavoli, who's been saying lots of things that just are not backed up by what we see on the ground. And earlier this week, we had Larry Johnson on, who made a certain comment that sparked my interest. And the more I've thought about this, the more I think, yeah, this is something that really needs to be discussed. Earlier this week,
a great video to superimpose, to play in contrast, and then go back and pick up. I don't know if there's any good video footage of Westmoreland out of Vietnam.
Oh,
I guess all these guys take that class at West Point, how to lie your ass off to Congress. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, Gary's an amazing guy. I bet he'll, before the show's over, he'll probably come up with all three of those, man. Well, it wasn't just before the show was over exactly, but sure enough, we were able to come up with a lot of clips here. And listen, I just want to put some things together. Larry mentioned there General Westmoreland from the Vietnam War. He mentioned David Petraeus from the Afghanistan War, and then Cavoli from this one. So in light of what we saw from Keith Kellogg yesterday and what he said at the Times of London, et cetera, let's take a look at what Larry was talking about here. This is like the epitome of the most famous American generals from 1967 on forward. First, let's look at what happened before a joint session of Congress in April of 1967.
backed at home by resolve, confidence, patience, determination, and continued support, we will prevail in Vietnam over the communist aggressor.
Oh, yeah, all those applause. We will succeed. How did that work out? Now, listen, you might be tempted to think, well, maybe that was true in 1967 because we finally got out totally. I think it was 1972, 73 when, they had the really infamous Saigon picture where the helicopter was leaving with the last of the people. That's how ugly it turned out. But the truth was known at the time he made that. It was self-evident that we were not going to win militarily. It was clear. It didn't matter how much firepower we had. It didn't matter how many bombs, how many jets. The North Vietnamese enemy we were fighting at the time was a peasant army. They had most of their air power came from the Soviet Union, what they did have in the air, but the North Vietnamese themselves had virtually none. And yet they were willing to make the sacrifice on the ground to be able to win, no matter what we were able to impose of a cost. It was an existential issue to them, and they were willing to pay it because it was their literal livelihood on the line. Whereas for us, it was half a world away. Most people in America had never heard of it. We weren't going to be able to sustain the cost that it was going to be on American troops, et cetera. It was self-evident at the time, but that's what our generalship said. That was what was said. The president wanted to hear that, so that's exactly what he got. But reality will eventually impose itself on top of your preference. This is the key. You keep hearing me talk about this every time we've ever been on this air. We've been talking about this forever, which is what is going on the ground. The ground truth must be acknowledged. If you don't pay attention to the ground truth and you try to make policies based on the fiction you've chosen to create, eventually, at some point, those two things are going to clash and reality will always win. That's what happened in Vietnam. That's also what happened in Afghanistan. Here is this from the ever-popular General David Petraeus in March of 2011.
As a bottom line up front, it is ISAF's assessment that the momentum achieved by the Taliban in Afghanistan since 2005 has been arrested in much of the country and reversed in a number of important areas. Of note as well, the progress achieved has put us on the right azimuth to accomplish the objective agreed upon at last November's Lisbon summit, that of Afghan forces in the lead throughout the country by the end of 2014.
Okay, so now if I can say, because of what I've read from the Vietnam War history, that even at the time he made that comment that it was known that we were not going to win that war, I don't have to worry about reading anything from this one. I was on the ground in March of 2011. When he made that speech, I was in Afghanistan. I was part of the surge that he was bragging about in that speech, saying that we had arrested Taliban momentum, we were on the right azimuth, and all the stuff that he said on that. I knew for a fact that it was a lie. In fact, that's one of the things that drove me, that and the cost to the American soldiers of other generals who had lied during the time and claimed great victories when I knew for a fact on the ground were actually losses and failures. And yet you see every newspaper reported that because that's what the president at the time wanted. That's what Obama wanted. He wanted a victory. He called that the good war. The Afghan was the good war. The Iraq war was the dumb war that he wanted to get out of. And he ended up not getting out of that either, or getting back into it even before he left office. But the bottom line is that the general, along with many other generals, and I've written on this extensively at the time. You can Google, Davis and generals, and you'll find quite a bit of things that I wrote. But the fact is, they lied to us. They didn't misrepresent the truth. They didn't just give an optimistic view. It was a lie. They knew that those things weren't true, and yet they had them. And if you need any question about that, you don't have to take my word for it. But in 2019, the Washington Post came out with the Afghanistan papers, where they chronicled even more lies than I had talked about there. But it is validated. And yet, we keep listening to the guy. He still goes on television to this day. I've showed you many times a comment that he made to the BBC in May 31st, to be specific, of 2023, when he went out and told everybody how the Ukraine army, in great detail, it was actually a long clip that we've used, where he said that they're going to, they have a combined arms operation. They have trained. They have gotten all this equipment from the West. They really understand what they're doing. They have intelligence from the West, and the Russian side will crumble and might even collapse. And they may go all the way to the Azov coast. Then, of course, the exact opposite happened, whereas the Ukraine side didn't even break the first line of Russian defense. They got up to the first of 5 lines and never made it beyond that, and they've been on the back end ever since that time. Russia stopped the offensive, and then a few months later started their own, and it's continued on to this day, 2025. And yet we still listen to him. He still goes on major news media networks periodically. He still goes as an expert that's given all kinds of praise by the people that are interviewing him. And you see on the ground, you see chronicled this terrible record of the generals keep saying things that don't come to pass. And you just have to wonder, at what point are we finally going to wake up and recognize that what is said with these guys' mouths and all these chest medals on their chest and stuff doesn't happen on the ground. And so that's where we are today. I keep showing to you the reality. We show you what people are saying on the Russian side, on the Ukraine side, on the American side, the European side. We give you all of it in context, and we always go back to the map. This is the reality. This is where things are going right now. Here's the death toll on the Ukraine side. Here's the casualty counts on the Russian side. I'm telling you the whole picture. We're not making anything pretty or ugly or anything else. We're just saying this is what is, and these are the logical ramifications of that. But it's not just Westmoreland. It's not just David Petraeus and all those guys from his generation. It's the current generation. So here is what actually prompted Larry Johnson to make that comment, is what General Cavoli said in testimony before the United States Congress.
There's nothing inevitable in war. And the Ukrainians are in very strong defensive positions right now and are improving weekly their ability to generate force and to reinforce those positions. It is hard sitting here right now to envision a major Ukrainian offensive that clears everybody, out of every square inch of Ukraine. But likewise, it's very hard to envision Ukraine collapsing and losing that conflict. I do not think there's an inevitability to a Ukrainian loss.
It's hard to imagine a Ukraine offensive to clear out everybody back to the 1991 borders. I mean, that is absurd. That is nonsense. It's not hard. It's impossible. They tried it. The Ukrainians tried it when they had months of time to prepare, when they still had a lot of guys with experience that they had trained for the previous 8 years prior to the war breaking out. Then they had all the training, physical training on NATO territory, even in large units at some points. They had the intelligence from the West. They had thousands upon thousands of combat vehicles, tanks, armor personnel carriers, air defense batteries, missiles, air defense missiles, everything you can imagine, millions of rounds of artillery shells, 500 million, that's an actual number, of bullets of all different kind of calibers to go in machine guns, small arms fire, etc. 500 million. And what happened in 2023 when they did this, when they attempted to do what he said? They broke their teeth on the first row. And now then they've been on the back ever since. Now then they're digging into the bottom of the barrel. They're now going after basically teenagers in their country. And you say it's hard? It's impossible. You say there's nothing inevitable in war? Oh yeah, there is something inevitable. And even after the Battle of Kursk, in I think late 1943, on the Eastern Front between the Nazis and the Soviet Union, it was inevitable that Germany was going to lose after that. There was very practical reasons why: manpower issues, the fact that there was another front that had been opened up or would be opened up by the Allies in the West, and then the fact that the Soviets had fully mobilized everything, and they were willing to spend, like the North Vietnamese, they were willing to spend whatever personnel it took in order to get that won. And it was inevitable at that point. But the Germans kept fighting anyway until finally the reality played in, and it played out according to what the logic of military science would say. And that's what he's not willing to recognize. He's saying what is popular. He's probably saying what, even if no one told him what to say, he's saying what he thinks he's supposed to say, given the political realities or whatever. I can only speculate on what may have been his motivation. He can only speak to that for himself. But what I can tell you for sure is the stuff that he's saying, like David Petraeus in 2011, like Westmoreland in 1967, it's not connected to reality on the ground. I mean, I could just show you right there what's tangible reality, the recent history. And he's saying it's hard. He should have said there is no way that they're going to be able to drive back to the 1991 borders. He should have said there's no way and said, well, it's hard. But then he used the same language to say, but it's also hard to see them losing. No, it's not. Now, this is a future issue, so you can't ever say with absolute certainty. No one can. But it is extremely likely, to the point of almost impossible to imagine any other outcome, that if the war continues on, the Ukraine side does not have the capacity to resist this indefinitely. There is an end, just like there was when David Petraeus said that in 2011, and then it took 10 years in that case, but the inevitability played out and we lost. Westmoreland said in 1967 they were going to win. It still took another, I guess it was 5 to 6 years after that before we lost and left in disgrace. And the same thing awaits us here. The same fundamentals which made those two things likely to the highest degree are also in place right now that make it likely to the highest degree. If Russia continues to fight at the level they're doing right now, even if they don't have a bigger mobilization, it's inevitable that they're going to crush the Ukraine side. It's simple math. It's simple dynamics of human behavior. You can't keep fighting a war that you have the lower inputs on. Go back again to Alex Vershinin's 2024, I believe, Royal United Services Institute, RUSI. He did this incredible analysis. If you want to know how attrition warfare works, and upon one of the things that I base what my projections are here and played out precisely in those other two conflicts that I just pointed out to you, read that article. Maybe General Cavoli should read that article. Unfortunately, he doesn't seem to pay any attention to that, at the demise and the cost of the Ukraine people, of the Ukraine armed forces, and of American interest. If he was just being honest, he would say some version of what I could say, or what I have just said, because that's the truth as demonstrated on the ground. There's nothing wrong with telling the truth. Even in congressional hearings, even if it's not what anybody wants to hear, it's the truth. And if these people who listen to that make decisions, if the president of the United States listens to that and believes it, he may make different policy choices thinking that what you said is true. He may think, well, okay, I mean, if the Ukraine side is not going to lose, maybe I can put more pressure on Russia and not agree to all the territory they may want because they can't win anyway. And eventually the cost will be too high. You may be tempted to think that, but that's not what's actually the ground says. That's not what an analysis of the balance of power on the two sides and the forces between the two sides and the inputs that are available to the two sides says. So now maybe Trump is not going to be falling for that. And maybe that's the reason why Witkoff is talking about this. Maybe what John Helmer reported was true. And the fact that because that was back in February. And if Steve Witkoff went up there yesterday, and that is what they're talking about, then that may be indication that Trump is believing the truth and he's recognizing what's going on the ground, and he may be close to making a deal. Now, we have big issues with that, of course, because diplomatically, politically, and internationally, that's going to cause the Ukraine side to have to come to a decision point, which I mentioned at the beginning. They're either going to have to accept whatever Trump is willing to do with Russia, or they're going to go it on their own. And that's another hard thing that Trump probably has the decision point coming up soon. If Zelensky sticks with his current path and his current claims, that Trump may have to say, all right, I've outlined this. I've agreed to this with Russia. This can end the war. Our support stops on this day. Either you agree to it or you don't. If you don't, you're a sovereign country. You're the leader of your country. You can make whatever decisions you want. You'll do it without any American bombs, missiles, or bullets. That's just what you're going to have to say. And that'll be a hard one to do because he'll be accused of all kinds of things, et cetera. But it's the right call, and history will look well on somebody making that hard, right call. We'll have to wait and see how it's going to work out. But the next time you hear a general saying something that doesn't seem to line up with reality that you can observe, you're smarter than you may think. And so now you know. But anyway, we appreciate you. We appreciate Larry Johnson bringing that up. We appreciate Gary talking about it. And in fact, actually, before we get off, I think it's important to bring Gary in here since he put some of this together. And I know we talk about a lot of this stuff off the air, and people deserve to know about kind of what's going on behind the scenes here.
Yeah, Danny, I love that you connected the dots like that. I mean, going back to '67, who knows if it was even going on before that? You know, thankfully with the way the media is today and all the availability we have, that we can go back, grab those videos from before, and then what we have from Cavoli just in the last 2 weeks. He testified last week and this week. It really went under the radar. I think I didn't see it much anywhere. It was maybe covered, but that's why I'm so glad that we covered it, to hear this guy and what he was saying and how contrary it was to what Trump's vision is. And you know, and the way that you had said that and illustrated what these gentlemen are doing, they're not stupid people. They're not stupid people, and yet they're willing to say what they've been saying. Does it not only? I don't know what else to attribute it to except the power, the influence of the military-industrial complex, the power and the influence of the defense industry to drive these men to say these things. Because, as you say, you look at the battlefield and it's contrary to what's going on the ground. So why would you dare go in the direction that you're going with and promote a continual battle to continue?
You know, it's even more ironic because you may recall that there's one point, and I think this was actually in his prepared testimony, in his introductory remarks before the Senate, that I don't think he actually said out loud during the testimony. But what he wrote in there was that I talk about the balance of power all the time. On the Russian industrial capacity side, he said they will be able to make 1,500 armored vehicles of various types this year. And I forget the number of artillery shells that he's quantified in there that they could make, which dwarfs everything the combined total of all the Western countries can put together, and the manpower he talked about. And then you want to say that you don't see a path for the Ukraine to lose when you know they can't match any of that stuff. It's harder to reconcile the mention of those things. Even when he talked about the Russians, you may recall, I think we did mention this, that he said, yeah, sure, that they're doing better here and they've made some improvements, but you remember that thing. But overall, the Russian side is going down, 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 and the Ukraine side is improving. And I just like, why would you say that when you yourself just gave the inputs to why the Russian side is winning?
You know, Danny, it's almost like he wants to go down with the ship, you know, to the very last drop. You know, he'll just keep, holding on to that. And I can only think that if he's not getting direct compensation, there's some kind of agreement there with the defense industry that he's willing to keep playing that role for them. He's basically their spokesperson.
And I always hesitate to accept that, but it's harder and harder not to have that. I know you show all the time that picture from December of 2023, I think, when Zelensky's surrounded by all the defense industry guys.
Danny, I keep this picture in my back pocket.
Yeah, that's the one.
Because it says so much. It says so much.
All those smiling faces. We're talking about war. I mean, they're not even putting on the pretend that they're it's a grim situation and we're trying to help out. It's gleeful. It's joyous. Yay! We get more
more war.
Weapons. Okay, so we're rolling out towards maybe 2 years from that date, and the stocks probably are doing well. The contracts keep coming. Now we'll see what happens now because Trump hasn't offered any new money, so there's no new contracts for them. But there sure are in Europe. With this new package they just showed, those got to come from somewhere. So if it's the industrial complex here or there, maybe even a combination, because I know that a lot of the industrial capacity is very limited in Europe. So even if they pass money, some of those contracts are coming this way.
Well, I was just going to say, you can be sure and through whatever back channels or whatever it takes that, just because it's whatever France supplying or Germany supplying it, that the manufacturer isn't actually here on our side of things. So my gosh, that the web is that tangled that things can weave in and out and go in every direction like that. So for sure, just because it's not mentioned that it's the U.S. supplying it, it could easily be our manufacturing that is behind their supplying it.
And the sad thing is, I mean, on the one hand, we might like to say, well, like in these other two cases, time and reality will impose themselves, and this thing will come to an end, and it will be exposed about how this thing wasn't, that these things were never true. But now it took a long time, but Westmoreland was eventually humiliated and publicly shamed, but it was many years afterwards. It hadn't happened yet with Petraeus. To this day, he's still lionized.
Come on, Danny,
so,
we probably, I don't know, but at least once a month and sometimes twice in a week.
Yeah, because he keeps getting put on. He keeps getting put out there. So
well, that's what I mean. Yeah, he's revered. He's revered. He's held up. He's for them, he's just, well, he's the perfect spokesman for the industry for sure. Obviously, right? And he always has been. And it seems like
one thing I'm going to follow is that during this testimony, Cavoli mentioned that this is his last time to address Congress because he's going to retire and resign. And I'm going to be real interested to see where he lands up. Which defense contractor does he go to work for? How much money is he going to make? What's he going to do after that? And I bet.
Come on, we'd be shocked if he ended somewhere else, if he's not going to be on the board somewhere, just the way Petraeus is, on this very day. Has Austin landed anywhere? Do we know?
I haven't looked, but it's worth looking because I have great.
Really?
I mean, he came out of the defense industrial complex. He was on the boards of whatever before that. I can't imagine he's done anything besides that. Actually, are you looking up right now?
Well, that's our job. That's our next special, Danny, is to track these guys.
Where are they going?
Put somebody on their tail.
We do, because we're all about transparency and calling out the truth wherever it lands, and we're going to do that here. But anyway, it's just discouraging because whatever the motivation is, I bet there aren't many, and I won't say none, but I bet there aren't many that say, you know what, I'm going to keep advocating this because I want cash in my back pocket. I don't care how many Ukrainian people die, but it's too easy, I think, for these guys to say, no, as long as they want to fight, it's our responsibility to give them the weapons and the tools that they need. Now, I wouldn't do it, but if they want to, who are we to say no to? And you can give yourself all the salve on that, but that's thin gruel to me, because that's you trying to convince yourself because your eyes can certainly see the truth.
I agree, Danny. Listen, the money is too good to say no to. So with the thin veneer of what you just described, they're willing to hold up. They'll take that thin veneer. My gosh. Again, because the money's so good. The veneer is thick enough for me.
Yeah. And if anybody who cared about, humanity actually cared about the Ukrainian people, we would have ended this long, long ago. But I don't want to rehash that stuff I've said before. But anyway, you can continue to count on Daniel Davis Deep Dive with Gary and I. We're going to continue to bring you the truth, no matter what it is, because we are unintimidated, uncompromised, as Gary Shirt says right there, because that's kind of our thing. We want to do that no matter where it leads, because you deserve to know. So thank you very much, you guys. I hope you have a great weekend. We'll look forward to seeing you with a new set of shows to bring you new truth starting Monday morning. See you then.
Amen. Bye.
If